All right, now we're going to move on to talking about doctrine in Buddhism. So we're going to go over some of the core beliefs about the world and about overcoming suffering, which is really the sort of central aspect of Buddhism. We're going to start with our discussion of theology, which for Buddhism, right, this is our kind of our different religious tradition, if we want to call it a religious tradition. And for Buddhism, there is no high God. There is no capital G God. There is no being to worship, to pray to, that is going to offer one salvation or help in this world. But you'll notice here that I don't have atheism. So we're not going to define Buddhism as an atheistic tradition. Instead, we're going to define it as non-theistic. And that has to do with what and how Siddhartha Gautama taught about Buddhism. Remember that atheism is a strong belief that there is no God. So it is a form of belief, and it says definitively, right, that there is no God or God does not exist. But that's not what Siddhartha Gautama taught. That's not what the Buddha taught. The Buddha was not necessarily interested in metaphysical questions. And if you've taken any other philosophy course, you've probably studied something called metaphysics. And when we discuss metaphysics in philosophy, it's really the study of the nature of the world and the nature of things. So in metaphysics, for example, you would talk about, does God exist or not exist? Why is there evil in the world? What is the nature of our world? What is the core of human nature? Are human beings innately good or are they innately bad? So you're talking about the way things are, right? What is the truth of our reality? Those were not the types of questions that the Buddha was interested in. He was interested in why do we suffer and how do we overcome that suffering? And again and again and again, he repeatedly emphasized that. So in many of the teachings and the sermons that we have from Siddhartha Gautama in the sacred texts of Buddhism, his disciples would frequently ask him, is there a God? Is there not a God? Does evil exist? What happens after death? All those sorts of things. And the Buddha did not really want to answer those questions. He'd say, well, why does it matter, right? Why does it matter whether or not God exists? Why does it matter whether or not human beings are innately good or innately bad? The only thing that I can teach you and the only thing that really matters is that right now we suffer and we want to overcome that suffering. So that's what he was most interested in. So in terms of the discussion of the existence or non-existence of God, Siddhartha Gautama never said definitively, God does not exist. So he never took that strong atheistic viewpoint. Instead, he simply said, the God or the gods, right? Because remember, he grew up as a Hindu. They may exist, they may not exist. But either way, it doesn't really matter because they're not going to help you to overcome suffering and to achieve enlightenment and to achieve nirvana. Ultimately, that's the hard work that you have to do yourself. Right? I have to put in the hard work, and we'll talk much more about what that work is. I have to put in the hard work to overcome my suffering, to realize the nature of the world so that I can overcome my suffering. So Siddhartha Gautama really just said, don't worry about it, right? Don't worry about whether or not God exists or doesn't exist, because God is not going to help you to overcome suffering. That's something that you have to do. So that's why we classify Buddhism as a non-theistic religion instead of an atheistic religion. So that's the explanation there. So Buddha simply said, there may be a God, there may not be a God, but it doesn't really matter to us. So for Buddhism, there is no God. There is no God that you pray to, that you have communication with, that's the object of worship, because it's more of a self-help tradition, right? What do I need to do in order to overcome my suffering? Okay, so now we're going to move on to the next point here, which is the no-self doctrine. And I'm going to divide this slide up. We're only going to go through about half of this slide because we have sort of two of our major concepts, major doctrines of Buddhism. The first one being the no-self doctrine, and then in our next doctrine slide, which is the same slide, but we're going to divide it up into the next video, we're going to talk about the Four Noble Truths. So the no-self doctrine is a core doctrine of Buddhism, and it's also a difficult concept to understand. We'll go through what it is, what it means, but it's important to remember that this is something similar to Gnana Atman in Hinduism, that the understanding in Buddhism is that it takes many, many lifetimes to truly understand this doctrine and to live according to this doctrine. So you can see here, so I have it defined as no self, and you can see the words underneath that. The first one is anatman, and the second one is anatta. So it's the same word, just that anatman is in Sanskrit and anatta is in Pali. And remember I said most of our terms in Buddhism are from the language Pali, because that was the language that the first Buddhist texts were written in. But the Sanskrit term can help us to define it because we've already learned some of this term before, right? So just looking at this term, anatman, if we have the prefix an before something, in Sanskrit, it's very similar to English, right? If you have the prefix a before something, it usually means not, right? Not or no. And then Atman is the same as what we learned from Hinduism. It is your soul. So even though it's usually translated as the no-self doctrine in English, literally it means no soul, right? So this refers to the teaching of Siddhartha Gautama, that he taught his disciples that we don't have a soul. So the belief in Hinduism, right, remember that we have like a core and essence of our being, which is our soul, our Atman, and that soul is eternal, right? It goes, despite everything else that changes about our lifetimes, our Atman stays the same, and it goes with us lifetime after lifetime. Siddhartha Gautama taught that we actually don't have that. We do not have a soul. So the defining it as no self, just know that it's not the perfect definition, because oftentimes people are confused and think that this doctrine means that we don't exist, but that's not true. We do exist, so Siddhartha Gautama never denied that we exist. It's just that we don't have a soul. And what he meant by that is that we don't have anything about our person or about our being that corresponds to the definition of a soul. So remember, we defined a soul as that which is eternal, essential, and unchanging. So we're going through samsara, we're living lifetime after lifetime. Everything else about us changes, right? Our gender could change, whether we're human or animal could change. If we're Hindu, our caste could change. So all of these things change, but that's okay because we have this Atman, right? We have this soul that doesn't change. It's our true self. It's our true identity. And we really need to connect with this Atman. We need to understand and experience this Atman. The Buddha said that just doesn't exist. Just as everything else about us changes, that actually is everything. So the Buddha said everything about you changes. There is no part of you that is eternal. There is no part of you, even though Buddhism does believe in reincarnation, okay, and we'll talk more about this, there is nothing about you that is eternal, nothing about you that is unchanging. So everything about us changes. There is nothing that stays the same. There is nothing that stays unmoved. And this has to do with a core doctrine in Buddhism, a core term, which is impermanence. Nothing is permanent. Nothing stays the same. And that means that nothing about us stays the same. Everything about who we are is constantly changing. So there's a couple different ways that we can think about this. A couple different kind of stories that come out of Buddhism that help us understand this no self or anatman doctrine. And one of the stories is about a monk, a Buddhist monk from a very long time ago, who was trying to define this or to explain this doctrine to a king. So the king is having a hard time understanding this. Well, what do you mean everything about me changes? I know certain things change, but there has to be something about me that's stable, or that's truly me, that's my essence or my identity. And the monk compares it to a chariot. But we live in the 21st century, so we're going to compare it to a car. So he says, think of a car, right? Imagine, the image that comes into your mind when you hear the word car. And he says, well, when you think about that car, we call it a car. But what if I were to take one of the hubcaps away? Would you still call it a car? And the king says, yeah. Well, what if I were to take, a wheel away? Is it still a car? Yeah, it's still a car. What if I took one of the seats out? Is it still a car? Yeah, it's still a car. What if I took the carburetor out? Is it still a car? Yeah, it's still a car. So he goes through all of these different parts of a car, right? Even to the point of, what if I took the steering wheel away? What if I took the engine away? He says, yeah, we would still say it's a car. We might say it's a car that doesn't run, or a car that needs a new engine, but we would still call it a car. So the monk explains, we are like this as well, right? We have a term that we call ourselves. We use the word I, we use the word me, or we use our proper name, right? My first name is Elizabeth, right? So I have this name, I have this label, Elizabeth. But what I mean when I say Elizabeth is not one unified thing, right? You could take little things away from me. You could take certain experiences away from me. You could take days in my life away from me. And that wouldn't change the fact that I'm Elizabeth. That wouldn't change what you called me. So when we use the word car, we're not referring to one single thing. What a car is actually thousands upon thousands of individual pieces configured in just a certain way that we happen to call that a car. But there's no core to that car. There's no soul to that car, right? There's not that one piece that you could take away, and then all of a sudden it's not a car, it's something else. So we as human beings are like that as well. There is no one part of us that is the essence or the core or the soul of who we are. All we are is a constantly changing collection of memories, experiences, hopes, fears, dreams, emotions, everything that we go through every single day. That is who we are. So we do exist. We are here. We are real. But all we are is this collection of everything that goes into us, our thoughts, our feelings, our fears, our hopes, our dreams. And those never stay the same, right? Those are constantly changing. Every single day, I have new thoughts, new experiences, new emotions, new fears. So everything about me is constantly changing. So the Anatman doctrine, or the no-self doctrine, again, doesn't say that we don't exist. Buddha just taught that there is no single core or single essence to us. Everything about us is constantly changing. Just as, every what we call a car is really just a combination of thousands upon thousands of pieces. And just like with a car, you could replace those pieces, right? It's not like it has to be that exact piece. So you can replace those pieces, you can mix and match, and it's still a car, right? And we are the same. So another way to think about this is to think of how we have changed throughout our life. Because we know that obviously we have changed a lot throughout our entire life. We are not the same person that we were, a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, however long your life is. So another story that comes out of Buddhism is to think of yourself as a baby, right? We've probably all seen pictures of ourselves as babies. And, to think back to that being like, wow, that was me, that was me. I was a baby at one point. All I could do was, cry and poop and eat, and that's about all babies can do. I know, because I have a 1-year-old, that's about all babies can do. And to think of that baby and to ask yourself, is there something that connects me to that baby? Is there something about me today that is the same as me as a baby? Is there some sort of unbroken line of continuity? Or has everything about me changed since I was that little baby, right? That little tiny human being. And Buddhist, excuse me, Buddhist teaching says, no, you don't have anything in common with that baby. There is nothing about you today that is the same as that child, right? Everything about you has changed since then. And when we look back upon the entirety of our lives, it's easier to see, right? It's easier to see that, of course, everything physical about us has changed. Everything mental about us has changed. We are totally different people than we were as babies, as young children, than we are today. The Buddhism says we have to remember that process of change is happening all the time, right? So it's not just that I'm, different today than I was 20 years ago, or than I was 10 years ago, or 5 years ago, or a year ago. I am different today than I was yesterday because I have had a new collection of experiences today. I am actually different than I was 30 minutes ago because things have happened to me in the last 30 minutes. I have had thoughts, I have had experiences, I have had emotions, I have had fears. So everything about us is constantly changing. And the idea behind this doctrine, again, is not metaphysical, because Siddhartha Gautama was not interested in proving definitively the nature of reality. So it is not so much in adopting this doctrine that the Buddha is saying this is definitively who we are, right? We care about the truth of what we are. Do we have an Atman? Do we have a soul at the core of our being? His idea behind the no-self doctrine was that if we think of ourselves in this way, it will allow us to live more compassionate lives. So the idea is that if I have a strong sense of self, right, if I have a strong sense of a personal essence and identity and unchanging soul, then I will end up living my life in service of that I, right, in service of me, in service of Elizabeth. Because I believe that there is something essential about me. There is something unique and individual about me and stable about who I am. So I will just naturally end up making decisions based on that I. Well, what is good for Elizabeth? What is good for me? But if I can live my life as if the no-self doctrine is true, if I adopt that attitude towards myself, then Siddhartha Gautama says that it will allow you to see yourself as simply a constantly changing collection of thoughts and feelings and experiences. And as your environment changes, those things will change as well. And therefore, who you are is intimately connected to others around you, right? That it will sort of shake yourself free of this attitude towards yourself as this stable, individual, and independent being. And to see that actually everything I am is intimately connected to everyone around me, because my collection of thoughts and feelings and experiences is influenced by others around me. So the hope or the goal of this doctrine is that it will allow individuals to live a more compassionate life, right? If I don't have a strong sense of I, then I can make decisions based on others instead of decisions always serving that I. So that's sort of the main idea of the no-self doctrine. As I said, but this is something in Buddhism that is understood to be very complicated, very confusing, and Buddhists will spend their entire lives trying to come to a better understanding of this and to try to live according to this teaching. So I definitely also recommend looking at the textbook chapter that discusses Anatman as well, if you have some questions or confusions about this, or to post in the discussion questions about this as well, because it can be confusing. It's a very different sense of self than Western culture. In Western culture, we tend to have a very strong sense of self and identity. We are very individualistic. We are very independent. So this is a very different attitude towards oneself. Okay, then the last thing that we're going to talk about for this part of the slide, and we'll continue, I'll talk about the second part of the slide in the second video, is simply the discussion of cosmology, remember, which is where we find truth in the world. And Buddhism, similar to Hinduism, says that we can learn that truth, or we can find that truth within ourselves. And especially in Buddhism, because it's a non-theistic tradition, right? There is no external source of truth, such as a god, a higher being, something like that. So in the Buddhist tradition, you always find truth within yourself. The idea is that, in one sense, you already know these things to be true. And the Buddha always taught, right, was, as we mentioned at the beginning, to be a lamp unto yourself, right? Don't trust a teaching, don't believe a teaching, don't follow a teaching just because a sacred text said it, just because an authority figure said it, just because it's always been believed or been understood that way. That you need to look within yourself and try out that doctrine, right? Is this true in my own life? Right? So the no self doctrine, it isn't about proving whether or not it's true or untrue. The idea is, well, try adopting that attitude towards yourself and see if it lets you live a more compassionate life. And if it does, then it's true, right? Then it offers a form of truth that is valuable. So in Buddhism, we look within ourselves in order to find or to confirm the truth of these teachings. And a central way that Buddhists do that is through meditation. So I'm gonna have you guys practice some meditation so that you can see what this is like if you haven't done meditation before. But through meditation, we learn more about ourselves. We become more strongly connected with ourselves. We learn to control our mind. And the hope is that we actually will see the truth of the Anatman doctrine if we learn to truly confront ourselves and see ourselves for what we are. And that we'll find that we're not these stable, essential beings. We are this constantly changing collection of emotions, thoughts, experiences, etc., etc. Okay, so we're going to stop there for now, and then in the next slide, or the next video, we're going to talk about the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism. Okay.